They're pushing toxic chemicals into the earth. How could that possibly be excusable? But I came to discover that water wells in places like Greencastle have been, it's not hydrofracking. They've used fracking, though, techniques that have pushed diesel fuel and propane fracs and all this into the ground. And I realized that 200 gallons of diesel fuel is not 3 million gallons of fracking fluid. But I started to see, wow, the collection of energy has always been an issue. And so you have to sort. I think you have to sort and push through and kind of reject the easiest solutions. I've said before that, in my opinion, the real problem is the great churn of industry driven by population growth that's out of control. Every time I do one of these stories, whether it's education or I haven't done a lot of science, but I've done a lot on energy collection. I'm shocked by how unwilling we are as a kind of species to say we're so afraid to talk about population growth and unchecked population growth on a planet where one side looks like all water from space. We think there's enough of everything, and I think obviously we're coming to that point where that should be questioned. What do you do when you talk about fracking? One thing is that the industry is succeeding by, just from your question, it's easy to infer that they've blurred it enough that nobody knows. And yet it's also possible to say that the resistance to it is driven by kind of a council of progressives who cannot seem to hit one message. Some concentrate on the local problems, which are profound. In Montrose, where fracking was born, but others want to scare people, like the southern tier of New York, where there's very little industry except for fracking. And the fracking has built schools and hospitals, and those people have now voted at town council meetings very rapidly, have eliminated fracking, and then been told, well, we're already fracking here. And then those wells are grandfathered in, and people just want to wash their hands of the problem. It's just never that simple. And I think it's a question about humanity as much as science. It's a question of how far, how far are we willing to go down this rabbit hole with, I hate that term, but with fossil fuels. And, you got a bunch of deniers in the industry, and you got people who think they're a bunch of true believers on the other side too, who in the end fail because they suggest that they are the ones with the answer. The industry doesn't suggest that. The industry sort of suggests, well, it's always been this way, or we're doing our best, or we're a lot better than we used to be, and that's still blurring the question. I don't know. You could put the Marcellus Shale under a reserve, but eventually people would get down there and figure out how to get that gas out, because people do that. And methane hydrates, the things that people point to now, are just as pie in the sky as shale fracking was 10 years ago. And I guarantee the moment we start using, say, the Chinese just developed recently an experiment in harnessing the tides. And I just feel that it's a guarantee that it will create a problem in the environment, as certainly collection of methane hydrates will. These are the future technologies, and solar is, as we're all starting to learn, about the manufacture and collection of small amounts of very dangerous metals, heavy metals, and fluids and things that we're still going to have to dispose of. So when somebody creates a vast solar array, they're creating an environmental problem. I don't think we can use no energy. I mean, I drove over here. I told you that. 3 blocks, but you ought to be, thinking about stuff you do. And so I think that in that way it's valuable. But I think you have to study. And first thing I did is at Purdue, and I went and bought a used textbook, it's true, geology textbook, to try to look at petroleum collection techniques, and that's where it began for me.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I can talk forever, obviously. Mm-hmm. I think that one thing you can do is this test. When you can draw a mechanical process on a napkin and explain it to somebody who's interested but has no real knowledge, then you start, I think that's a level of expertise. It doesn't relate to degrees or anything like that, but that's a valuable exercise. And one of the things before I started doing television shows, and I didn't do a lot of them, but I started making appearances, was I said, I better be able to explain this to my mom. And while she appreciated it, it's always been a good test for me because she spent years explaining things to me in very clever ways. But all I tried to do is to draw it, the process, the curve well. I described this giant bend. It's really a remarkable thing to see a steel pipe that's been bent a half a degree. And so the only way you could tell if it was even bent was to roll it. And then you'd still question, was that bent? And then they string these pipes together and make a big bend that's a mile long underground. This is kind of an exciting storytelling almost. But it's also its scale, it's the dangers of it, all this stuff are expressed in the diagram you can draw on a napkin. And I think that's the first thing you should do in looking at fracking, is to be able to explain it to another person accurately. And it took me a month of sitting there and talking to people, stepping in a bar, and really talking to people who were frackers. That's a weird title. And saying, okay, do I have this right? And anybody who's sort of in the industry is a kind of a, I don't want to say it's an art, that seems trite, but they want you to have the facts right when they're the people who are doing it. I never met a fracker, and I met 4 of them, who didn't want me to have it dead right, who didn't roll his eyes at my misunderstanding and then return to it. Not because he was threatened, but because he'd been doing it in Texas for 20 years and he'd gotten better. The fracking trailer on a site is the most protected place in the whole industry because those guys work with mixtures, obviously, but compression ratios and things that is extremely proprietary. And yet when you talk to people, I mean, they want you to get it right. And they don't, because in a sense, the process itself is an explanation of the problem. And so I never regret learning about it. I kind of regret that it's been 2 years and I've sort of forgotten. Mm-hmm. But I'll tell you this, I went to an injection well site and in Ohio, and I wasn't allowed to go on it, but I walked straight through and I got up to an injection well, which just had a padlock on the top of it and no hydraulic or mechanical cap because they just opened it up. And I said, what do they put down here when the guy came to take me out of there? And they started to list it off. And the list appears in my article, but it's, from medical waste to perfume, excess perfume, to fracking fluid. The difference between I don't know how toxic perfume is. I mean, they burn perfume, burn it, Chanel as I understand, in Greencastle at the cement plant, the incinerator. But they study it. They dump it into the earth over there. I don't know how toxic it is, but I do know that the real problem with fracking came when I saw one truck of whatever an industrial byproduct being put into the ground, and it doesn't need a cap. It just kind of pours in. I mean, it goes down a long way, but they capped it. That's not really true, but it didn't need it. But when they bring in the fracking fluid, they cap it, screw it down, and put it under high pressure because it has to really be injected. And that's when you watch that, and I only watched it from a distance because, they wouldn't let me. It's many dozens of trucks, scores of trucks coming in and being hooked up, and that stuff's being pushed down there, and you think the whole trick is the volume. I mean, as bad as that stuff is, the stuff that's down there with it is just as bad. And when you start to picture that, 3 trillion gallons of that shit that's down there, it starts to feel like fracking is just a small part of the problem. It doesn't mean that fracking isn't a problem. And I don't know, how do you get a perspective on that? I tell you, as a parent, it really scares you, all of it. I mean, it scares me. It scares me and makes me feel irresponsible, but I'm not going to suddenly feel responsible if everybody, if we dictate to one another the way we drive, move, think about the world. So it has to be understanding, and all you can do is study.